Hey everybody, John 1:16 through 17 says, "Out of his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." Who is that person who just rubs you the wrong way? We frequently have a neighbor who honks for someone to come out to their car. Usually this happens at night, and it's after our kids are already in bed asleep. And it's just like, why are you doing that? Like, you should know better. All of us can think of that person or a situation where someone just doesn't do what they probably should do, and it just irritates us. It rubs us the wrong way, or maybe they even wrong us. How do you respond in situations like that? If we're honest, we intuitively want to respond in kind, evil for evil. Simply put, our intuitive reaction is not to show grace. At best, we maybe extend grace once to somebody, but only that one time. And after that, we're jumping in to do something to correct them. But really, if we're honest, we don't want to extend grace at all. How much are we expected to extend grace to others? We are to extend grace to the extent that God extends grace. Every time we withhold grace from someone, we hinder God's mission from progressing. The good news of John 1:16 through 17 is that God's mission progresses when grace upon grace is extended. God's mission progresses when grace upon grace is extended. My wife and I were watching the show Buddy vs. Christmas about a week ago, and part of the show is that Buddy, the famous baker from the Food Network, has to make a giant creation out of only cake and decorating items, but he goes against different people who have different skills. Like, one might be a craftsman, someone might be a machinist, and in this particular episode, he went against somebody who builds like giant Lego creations. And as the teams get started on their creations, the Lego team started building their bot that they were going to build for this particular episode. And one person, the lead person, was giving everybody instructions about what to do, especially like this team over here, like, you're going to build the legs. And he told them everything to do, and they went off and did it. Well, after a while, they ran into a snag where they were going to run out of pieces, and the bot wasn't going to be able to be built as they wanted it to. And so the team leader over the whole group had to come over and actually show them how to correct what they were doing. You see, the instructions that they were given were good enough to get them started, but they weren't complete or clear enough to clarify when things would go wrong. And so this person had to actually step in and help them in the situation. The team, if you will, needed a second grace. The instructions they were given at first were a grace given to them to help them get started, but the team building this Lego creation needed a second grace to progress the mission. The team needed someone to embody the instructions so that the mission could move forward. God lays out this dynamic in the same way. He does the same thing in John 1, verses 16 and 17. John lays out how Jesus is the fullness of God's grace. So if we want a picture of God's grace, look at the life of Jesus. John also lays out how Jesus was not the first time that God had made his grace known in the world. The law of Moses was a previously given grace that was given to the Israelites. The law of Moses was kind of like being given instructions for a Lego model. They helped the people to know what was right and wrong. It helped them to get started in knowing how to live the life that God had for them. The Apostle Paul echoes the grace of God in the giving of the law of Moses when he says in Romans 7, verses 7 and 12, "Is the law sinful? Certainly not. The law is holy, and the commandment is holy, righteous, and good." The law was good, but in John 1, John lays out how God has shown grace in a further way through Jesus. Jesus, John says, and especially in the 2011 NIV version, is grace in place of grace already given, or grace upon grace. The idea being here that one form of grace was previously given, and now something else has followed. A second form of grace has followed. Jesus is the second form of grace that God has given. But notice that the grace that comes through the coming of Jesus is highlighted by truth. Now, this is not to say that the previously given grace that God gave through the law of Moses was false. Rather, Jesus provides just a clear revelation of the truth of God. So clear that it makes the law of Moses, the truth of the law that the law of Moses had, just seem piddly in comparison to the clarity that Jesus brings. For Jesus is truth embodied. Jesus is the grace of God embodied. To see the grace of God, we look at the life of Jesus and we'll see it. We see here in John 1 that God's mission progresses by the extending of grace upon grace. Grace is the posture by which God acts. So too, grace is the posture by which we, as God's children, if we follow after Jesus, it's how we too are to act. Jesus models this in how he forgives people, especially the irredeemable of his day, and also in his teaching his followers to forgive over and over and over again. Grace is the posture by which Jesus interacted with others. And if we too are following after Jesus, and if we are God's adopted children, then we too are called to live in this posture of grace. Now, living in a posture of grace doesn't mean that truth doesn't matter. Often, I think this is our fear. If we live in grace, then we're sacrificing truth. But that's not the case. I think this fear is present because we believe that grace and truth can't exist together. If you're gracious, you can't have truth. If you're truthful, you can't be gracious. But if we look at God, if we look at the life of Jesus, we see that they do exist together. In Jesus, we see that he embodies a posture of grace. Posture matters in embodying truth. Like if I were to yell at you, I love you, I may actually love you, and I may even embody that normally, but my posture in yelling it at you is not conveying that I actually do love you, because the posture I'm presenting to you is more of a threatening posture, not a loving posture. It's not going to be in a place where you can receive it because my posture isn't gracious toward you. But Jesus embodies truth in a graceful posture so that others can receive the truth that he is embodying and that he is presenting to them. The grace that Jesus reveals, it's not passive, it's active, it's embodied, it's lived out. Something that sometimes that means embodying truth to the point of suffering, like we see him doing on the cross, but sometimes it also means embodying truth to the point of avoiding pain, like when we see Jesus escaping those who are trying to throw him off a cliff in Luke 4. When we look at the life of Jesus, ultimately, Jesus embodies truth in a posture of grace that ultimately leads to the greatest opportunity for God's mission to move forward. When people were trying to throw Jesus off the cliff, Jesus escaping was the greatest thing he could do to advance God's mission in that moment. It wasn't that he avoided truth, but he was trying to also look out for the mob that was there, and that he didn't continue to kind of instill that vibe that was going on there. But at the same time, when it came to the cross, Jesus embodied the truth by suffering in that moment. What we see here is that God is gracious through Jesus in the posture he presents himself to us, but he's always embodying truth. As Jesus embodies truth in a graceful posture, God's mission to redeem the world progresses. God's mission progresses by the extending of grace upon grace. This past year, I've tried to memorize and kind of keep in the back of my mind Proverbs 10:19, which says, "Too much talk leads to sin. Be sensible and keep your mouth shut." That's the New Living Translation. The wisdom of this verse has entered my mind many times in many situations over the past year. They have reminded me that embodying truth means more than forcing my point across to somebody else. If I believe something is true, I stick to it, but I do so in a posture of grace in relation to the other person. And this has helped to de-escalate many situations. The principle here also reminds me of a situation I had with a professor of mine when I was in college. A group of us had gone over to his house to watch a movie which brought up a controversial point, and we had a conversation about that after the movie, and a few people said their thoughts. I eventually said my thought, and at the end, our professor basically kind of just said, "This is what I think," and he left it at that. But his conviction about what he thought was so different than what most of us were presenting, and so it made us wrestle with what we thought, what we believed, what our convictions were. And I didn't change my mind in that moment, but the point that he made and that he said stuck with me, that I wrestled with it for days and months and just doing a lot of different research, that eventually down the road I did change my conviction to match what his was. But what stands out here is that he embodied truth in that moment, but he did so in a gracious posture. But in doing so, it allowed me the opportunity to eventually step into the conviction that he had, which eventually progressed God's mission further into my life because of his graceful posture and the truth that he was holding to. Because God's mission progresses when we extend grace upon grace. The grace of God is never at the expense of the truth. As followers of Jesus, we too are called to Jesus' way of life. God's mission progresses when we extend grace upon grace. What situation in your life comes to mind where you are easily tempted to respond ungraciously? What situation comes to mind where you believe being gracious can't possibly be a good thing? Today, the good news of Jesus invites you to take those extra steps of grace with people, just like God does with us, just as Jesus modeled and teaches us to do as his followers. In doing so, you have the opportunity to embody truth still, but you also have the opportunity to participate in God's mission progressing into the lives of others as you give them opportunity to receive the good news that you embody. Because God's mission progresses when we extend grace upon grace. God's mission progresses when we extend grace upon grace. I'll see you next time.